All right, thank you all for your patience. I think we're just going to go ahead and start with the introduction, and then I will lead it over to Michael. So thank you for joining us tonight for Pastures and Parasites. We're really excited to have our guest speakers, Michael Hipp and Dr. Dana Bridges-Westerman. I am your host, Sarah Rosero, and I've been with the district for a couple years now, different capacities. I've worked on our Veterans Conservation Corps. I've worked with SCD as a AmeriCorps, Washington Conservation Corps member, and have continued to enjoy working at the district as an outreach and community engagement coordinator. So our topic tonight is pastures and parasites. We're going to be learning all about pasture management, some internal parasites, and how some of those two can really work together to keep your horse healthy and keep the land healthy as well. So, typical Zoom webinar, if you want to ask questions, we please ask that you type them into the Q&A. Chat can be used for any technical questions or comments that you would like to share as well. And if you folks don't mind, I would love to hear, and then I'll share where you folks are joining in and tuning in from tonight. So over Sandwich County, curious if there's any people from out of state, really interested. So type into the chat and let us know where you're listening from. So if you've never worked with a conservation district, we really offer just free technical assistance and sometimes financial assistance to land managers in Snohomish County, and we're also serving Camino Island. So we work with rural and urban residents, improving habitat, agriculture, resiliency, and water quality through BMPs, as we call best management practices. Like tonight, we help with pastures, weed, manure management, soil health, low impact development. We even have youth education services and of course, habitat restoration and lots of farm planning to assist you all. Some of our upcoming events, we're going to have a livestock community discussion on June 2nd at 7 p.m. And then we're planning more webinars for the summer, so keep tuning in to see what you all can register for. So today we have Michael Hipp starting off, and Michael has been a farm planner with the district for about 4 years now, or just over 4 years. He holds a degree in both chemistry and biological sciences, and with an emphasis on animal science and nutrition. And he's a Texas native. Of course, you know, that kind of gives way to the cowboy hat pictured. But not always. And he built and managed a horse ranch for many years north of Amarillo, where he trained and traded ranch horses and performed rehabilitation for horses that were seized by law enforcement due to neglect or abuse. His experience with horses continues to provide education and volunteers with 4-H and other services and organizations, and he really is so great at providing technical assistance to folks in such a relatable way. Of course, we're serving Snohomish County and Camino Islands. You know, people really enjoy meeting with Michael, discussing things with him. He's so relatable, and it really just shows that if you've ever met Michael. He's been able to really cultivate the sound horsekeeping community to what it is today. And it's been a pleasure to work with Michael on the sound horsekeeping program that he has going. Then we also have Dr. Dana Bridges-Westerman. Dr. Dana's whole life has been dedicated to helping animals. After becoming a veterinarian, Dr. Dana worked for the State of Hawaii Board of Agriculture, then practiced in 3 mixed animal practices. And in 1995, she founded Professional Equine Therapeutic Services. Along with being committed to helping animals, she's traveled the world to assist animals in need of veterinary care. She flew to Louisiana to assist with animal rescue in post-Katrina New Orleans. She also donates her time to outreach groups with 4-H, schools, and nursing homes. She's on staff with the World Vets and has traveled extensively to provide veterinary care in developing countries. So as a 24/7 veterinarian on call, if an emergency does come up, Dr. Dana will have to leave us. That does take priority, but we're hoping she doesn't get a call until after, or maybe just not tonight. Let's give her a night off, but definitely an emergency, that's her duty, and we're going to be understanding. Want to also acknowledge our partners. So Department of Ecology helped sponsor this, as well as Dr. Dana's time and Michael's time with Snowmarsh Conservation District. And we all just wanted to give you a thank you and appreciate you for tuning in. And now I'm going to pass it off to Michael. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, that was a great intro. I was listening to you talk about me. I'm getting kind of nervous now, but but thank you all for coming. Tonight we're going to talk about pastures and parasites. Dr. Dana is going to share with you the details about the parasites and how they affect the horse and their cycles of reproduction in the horse and all of that. And then I want to talk to you tonight about the pastures and how you can care for the pastures and how maybe how your pastures, how they may look right now and how they may be harboring those parasites that are out there. If you've got overgrazed areas or you have weeds in some areas, or if you have some soil that's not at 100%, maybe harboring some of those things. So we'll talk about that a little more in detail. Again, Sarah touched on the services of the district. There really is an amazing amount of free services that the district provides. We come out to write farm plans, do soil testing. We have a manure spreader, a large one and a small one, depending on the size of your farm, that is free to use right now. So yeah, please take advantage of these things. You know, you spend about $7 a year on your taxes for to help us fund the district. So use it. It's a great service. So again, talking about Dr. Dana, hopefully she'll be joining us here quickly. She is an amazing veterinarian. I've worked with her for a couple of years now. She's actually my personal veterinarian for my horse, and I couldn't ask for better. She is just a wealth of information, and I can't wait to hear everything she has to say about the parasites. Then there's me, of course, as Sarah was saying, I'm from the Texas Panhandle. Got my degree at Oklahoma Panhandle State. I've been working with animals and horses, specifically cattle, for a very long time, and horses for almost 40 years. So that's my passion in life, is to help people out with that. And so that's why I'm here. So to begin with, in this, again, in the pastures and parasites, I wanted to look at it as a battle that we're fighting here. And our enemy is the parasites. And how do we do that? I think we need to look at it in this way. We need to look at it like, we need to know first who the enemy is, who those parasites are, because parasites, there are many different parasites. Botflies are different than roundworms, and they all have different functions, and they all have different ways of attacking our horses. So I wanted to look at it that way, about who the enemy is first, and then we'll talk about where the enemy lives and what our battlefield is and how we could actually take control of that battlefield, which is the pasture, and make it one that we will be able to win on. So again, Dr. Westerman is going to talk to you about who the enemy is, and I will talk to you about where that enemy lives, what the battlefield is, and how we can take that battlefield and mold it to our advantage. Do we have Dana yet?
I do not think she's quite here yet.
Okay.
Still having technical issues, so apologize, everyone.
Okay. Well, let's do this then. Until she gets on, I will begin talking about the battlefield. How's that? And then we'll go back to the parasites. Go quickly through here. So when we talk about the pasture, or the battlefield, as we'll call it, There are actually two sets of factors that affect pasture health. There's the physical factors and the chemical and biological factors. If one of those is off, if you have a pasture that's completely protected, you never let horses out on it, it's just all by itself, and it never is touched, you would think that it's physically protected from everything. But if it's chemically and biologically off, if the soil is off, if you don't have the right nutrients in there, it's going to collapse. The same way as if you have all the great nutrients in there, you fertilized, you've limed, you've got everything perfect, but yet you're letting your horse out there at the wrong time, or horses or other livestock, the physical part's going to collapse. So you have to balance both of them evenly. You have to look at them both. And so that's what I want to look at. Because if either one of those fail, you're going to get parasites. They're going to be out there. They're going to be out there anyway on a healthy pasture. But on a healthy pasture, you've got a better chance of mitigating their activity than if you don't have a healthy pasture. So let's look at the physical factors first. They are all of the things that affect the well-being of the grass itself. Force impacts on wet soils that create the mud, excess water, which creates erosion, buildup of excess nutrients, and we'll talk about that in the chemical part, but that can affect the groundwater as well, and proper grazing to assure pasture recovery. The proper grazing part is letting the horses out there and eating too much of the grass, getting that stubble down to almost soil level. So that's a physical factor that can actually kill the grass and then affect the soil and everything else. So the first thing, I guess we all battle, and if you see the picture there, that could be from this spring. Even some of us have this pasture that look like that right now. The mud is unhealthy for animals, as we all know. You lose shoes. I mean, my horse has lost at least a handful of shoes already in the last couple of years in mud. Saps the body heat during the winter. Wastes feed. I mean, they get the hay gets in the mud, the horse is not going to eat it, so you're going to waste a lot of that. Slippery surfaces cause lameness. Puddles breed mosquitoes. It can breed disease-carrying fly larvae. There's a lot of other parasites that can breed in mud situations, so we want to avoid that. So some things that we can do for mud and pasture management. One is create a heavy use area to keep the horses on instead of the pasture. Install gutters and downspouts to keep that water from going off onto the pasture. Construct manure bins for storing it and storage and composting. The composting part, of course, would help the pasture. Once you get it composted and spread on the pasture, all those nutrients from that good compost can help the chemical part that we're going to talk about in a minute. And then the storage of the manure itself, because manure left out on a pasture, if it's rained on and it's not composted, it'll create mud really, really fast. It's an organic material, and it just turns into mud real fast. So, and then remove the horses from the pastures when they're saturated or too short to graze. So that's one physical way you can protect the pasture. Heavy use area, everybody's heard of that. It's an area that gets the most use from your horse, and that's not just the paddock area where you keep them over winter. It's the gates, the water trough areas. Those are heavy use areas as well. Protect those so that they don't get eroded. Roof water management. Now, this is roof water management is one of the most important things we have around here because we get so much of it. So there's a mathematical formula that I got from Texas A&M, and it actually calculates the amount of water that you'll get off your house, your barn, anything like that. So when you use this calculation, you figure out that a 30 by 50 barn, which is pretty average, and the 32 inches of rain we get annually every year, there's about 29,000, almost 30,000 gallons of water that barn will capture. Now, if you can imagine the soils around here, there are 81 different types of soils in Western Washington, and they all perform differently as far as how nutrients flow through them and how water flows through them, but they all have evolved over time so that they can absorb the rain, that 32 inches drop by drop. But when it comes off a roof in a sheet, it hits the soil really hard and fast, and it quickly saturates that soil around it. So the soil is just not built for that. That's why we need gutters and downspouts and things. So, and you can actually use some of that water as well in watering the livestock, watering your pasture sometimes, depending on how big of a barn you have or an arena or whatever. You can capture that water and use it. But again, you're going to be battling it. So the one thing we need to do to protect that pasture is to make sure that any excess water like is coming off of the barn, it's routed to a safe area and doesn't just hit the ground, saturate the soil, and then flood the pasture, because that'll destroy it as well and create a lot of mud. And one way we do that, as you can see on this arena here, is gutters and downspouts. Those are primary solution for that. And the underground outlets,
You are a
the downspouts are all tied together, and they
can
go underground to an area where they can actually exit safely. And so that, no problem. And so that underground outlet is actually the most important piece of this, because all that water that gets captured, if it comes out and goes into the downspout and then out onto the ground, it's just concentrated again and will head out toward the pasture and saturate it. So using an underground outlet, and I believe there's somebody on here who I was out at their place recently looking at their underground outlet that they installed. I was quite pleased when they told me that they didn't get any mud in their paddock this last winter, because they did exactly this. They put downspouts, gutters, and they installed an underground outlet where they tied all those downspouts together and routed that water off to a safe place. And that saved the area around their barn. It's a great system. I really highly recommend it, especially around here. So again, for mud and manure management, you want to create that heavy use area, large enough for the horse, but small enough to pick the manure. And then pick the manure daily, or at least every 3 days, or you will lose the battle with the mud. that stuff will create mud real fast. And then place manure storage near the heavy use area for chore efficiency. I mean, you don't want to put it in a wagon and then have to haul it halfway across your pasture. You want it near there. So that's how we control the mud and the manure. And this is a picture of a manure bin. It's got a gravel base to it, and you'll see there right in the middle is a concrete runner. That concrete runner could be concrete, it can be steel, it can be an old railroad tie, just something so that the bucket of the tractor will hit it and slide against, instead of hitting the gravel and picking it up. So and this is just a basic bin here. You can see there's no roof to it. You put the manure in, you keep a tarp on it. Fairly inexpensive compared to some others. There are some really fancy ones out there with roofs and things, and you'll probably see another picture of one here soon, but that's just one that we recommend a lot. So if you're going to compost, there are some benefits, especially for parasite control. The compost uses the nutrients as fertilizer. So once you compost it, you can spread it out on your pasture. Now, the thing you want to be sure of, though, before you spread it, is that it is truly composted. It's not just like halfway or not composted at all, or, you know, well, I put a tarp on it and it didn't do anything. Well, you really got to work at monitoring the temperature and everything else, because if you don't get good composted manure, then you've just got manure and you're not going to have these advantages. Because one of the things that compost has as an advantage is it kills the weed seeds, but it also kills parasites and fly larvae. Most of the parasites that Dr. Westerman is going to talk about will be killed if the pile is at 130 degrees. Okay, so you have to get that pile up to 130 degrees, and about there, then most of the parasites, except for strangels, will die off. If you got strangels, you want to go up to 160. Okay, so if you get it above 160, all of your parasites are going to die off, at least all the ones that I know of, and then the fly larvae as well. So if you just keep it uncovered, it's just a pile, it's going to be a nest for all kinds of parasites, and then you're going to spread that on your field, and then they're going to get all over the place. So not recommended at all. So please think about properly composting it. It also increases the good soil microorganisms. There are microorganisms in the soil organic matter that actually are needed by the plants, by the grass plants and any of the plants out there, to transform some of the nutrients like phosphorus and potassium into a form that the plant can actually take up. And some of these processes require microorganisms. So it's amazing how the plant and these microorganisms and the nutrients just so happen to work together like that. They do. And so if you have good compost, you can actually increase those good soil microorganisms, as well as adding organic matter to the soil. You'll also reduce your waste volume up to 50%. For those of you who have composted before, you put the manure in the bin, you put the tarp on it, and you let it go and monitor the temperature and all that, and you'll notice that thing drop down. I can testify, because I have a pile at home that has been covered for 2 years now, and it's in the first year it dropped 50%, and in the second year it dropped 50% from that. So it's at about 25% of what it was in the very beginning. So you can reduce that volume of waste. If you think that, well, I don't have enough room in my manure bin for this, or you call me up and I do all the calculations and tell you you need a 3-bin system and the bins need to be this big, and you get concerned because, well, I don't think that's right. Well, just wait. If you properly compost, it drops down, the volume drops down, you move it around. Yeah, it works out. It's amazing how it works.
How often do you have to turn the pile?
That I monitor that with by monitoring the temperature. So when it comes to composting, you want to monitor 3 things. You want to monitor the temperature, the moisture, and the air. Now, it's hard to monitor the air level, but you can monitor the temperature and you can monitor the moisture. So one thing to keep in mind with composting is that we are dealing with microbes, microorganisms, and they're living creatures. So they need, like any living creature, they need water, air, and they need heat because they're exothermic. That means they get their heat from outside. If they begin to get cold, they will begin to slow down until they eventually die off. So we want to make sure that they're warm enough, they're moist enough, and they have enough air. So once they start doing their job, the heat that is generated in a compost pile actually comes from their metabolism. And so if they're eating and they're having a good time, they're creating heat, that temperature in that manure pile will come up to about 130 degrees. If it begins to drop below that, and you can check to see if it's moist enough. If it's too dry, add some water, it'll kick back up. If it's too wet, well, you might take the tarp off, let it dry out a little bit, but usually they get a little dry. But if the moisture's good and the temperature is still dropping, it's probably an indicator that they're running out of air. And so that's about when I want to turn the pile. As long as the temperature on it's about 130 degrees and staying pretty steady, you don't have to touch it. But if it starts to drop, that's when it's an indicator to me that they might be running out of air, and then you can turn it. So great question. So yeah, composting is very, very important. And I think especially if you've got horses and you're trying to use the compost for putting nutrients back onto your pasture. This is the biggest part of the battle right here in stopping parasites, is to make sure that you've properly composted that manure, because if you haven't, if your horse has any parasites and they've gone into that manure pile, all they'll be doing in that manure pile is breeding. And then you'll take that and you'll spread it out onto your pasture, and then you increase the number of parasites out there. Then you let the horse out and then it ingests more parasites, and then the cycle just continues and continues. So this is a big part of the fight right here. If you want to slow that cycle down or even stop it in some aspects, you want to make sure you properly compost. So now we're going to look at the chemical and biological health of the pasture, because again, we can look at the physical aspects of the pasture, but there's chemical and biological things going on in the pasture that if we don't have healthy soil, we're not going to have healthy grass. And if we don't have healthy grass, that can also lead to horses going out and picking and chewing down grass to the soil level, which is where a lot of these parasites are, or below 3 inches on the grass stem. So we want to make sure that we have a nice healthy pasture with good strong grass that can grow to proper lengths in order for the horse to be able to graze it properly without having to go all the way down to the soil level. Okay. So again, why do we care about the grass part? Well, for me specifically, I'd rather feed my horse grass out of the pasture than something baled that I have to pay for. You can get 2 to 4 tons of feed out of a normal pasture in Western Washington, maybe even 6 tons if you've got the right soil. So use it to your advantage. Animals enjoy grazing. My horses enjoy grazing a whole lot more than they do feeding out of a round bale or anything like that. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but I go home and I go to turn my horses out on the grass right now, and it's like they're about jumping over the gate. So they just love it. And it's a whole lot nicer to look at a nice pasture. And most of the weeds that we can get out if we properly take care of the pasture are toxic to livestock anyway. Plus, a lot of the leaves, like milkweed and things, they tend to attract a lot of the parasites. So if we get rid of those and get some healthy grass in there, it's good stuff. There's a picture of a poor area. I'm going to show a picture at the end of this. My first ranch in Kansas that I built was an old wheat farm. And when I got it, it looked like this. It was just dirt and sand. And in 2 years, I was able to build it up to something really nice where I had my horses could graze. So I'll show you that in a bit. But this is probably what a lot of us are struggling with at times, but this is mud when it gets wet. This is erosion waiting to happen. And this is also, if you were to go along and scoop this up and put it under a microscope, you would see all kinds of parasites in this soil just waiting. And when a horse gets out on this, they start nibbling at grass laying on the ground or whatever they can find. When they do that, their lips are touching that soil, and that soil could contain that parasite. So not a good thing. We want the nice pasture. And the diet of livestock, as you can see, horses, 90% of their diet is forage, 4% weeds. They don't like the weeds. Browse a little bit, but 90% is going to be forage. So that's why we need good, healthy grass for them. Cattle, even if you have cows or anything, along that line, you're going to need good forage. Sheep, they're great. They have 60% forage, 30% weeds. If you've got sheep, you probably don't have very many weeds. They like the weeds. And then goats, 20% forage. They're more browsers. They like the browsing part. So get a mixture of sheep and goats. If you've got a pasture you need to clean up, they'll do a good job. So when we look at the grazing part, from the aspect of parasites, we don't want what's on the far right. Now, if your grazing period is continuous, meaning you turn your horses out there all the time, they're always grazing, you turn them back in, they're going to eat that down to, you know, about an inch off the ground or even soil level. They've got 2 teeth and they can just nip it right off at the ground level. And that, you can see the root response on that is it kills the roots, and eventually it's going to kill this plant, because if these roots can't get down to the level in the soil where the minerals are, where the good nutrients are, because nutrients, they survive in different horizons within the soil. If the root system can't get down there and get it, it's going to die off. And then all you're going to have is that bare area that we saw in that previous picture, and you're going to have parasites, a lot of them. So we want to make sure we're grazing it at the right level. Short grazing periods, it's going to have long, nice roots, good, healthy grass. And now we'll talk a little bit about the soil fertility. When I come out and do a soil test, I'm looking at 4 things primarily: your nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and the pH, which is really important around here because we're battling it a lot. We have very acidic soils, and those acidic soils tend to bind up nutrients in the soil, and so that makes it a struggle to grow good grass. So that's where liming and everything else comes in. And then I also look at my macronutrients such as calcium and magnesium. Sometimes those will get a little low, but we can compensate for those as well. Nitrogen, that's going to be your basic nutrient. It provides a lot of growth factors for the grass. It's kind of the main food. If you see a nice, lush, dark green pasture, it's got a lot of good nitrogen. So we look at nitrogen, and here's the nitrogen cycle. And this is where the compost comes in quite well, because it provides that organic matter. The soil organic nitrogen goes into the decomposers, creates all kinds of good stuff, and then back up into the atmosphere. So nitrogen is really, really important for the plants. And then you have phosphorus, and this is a picture I just want to point out. There's little white dots on here on the soil. If you look down there, you can see maybe 1 or 2 little white dots. That's actual phosphorus. That's crystallized, and so you can actually see that nutrient in there. When you get like potting soil, sometimes it's got filler pieces in there, but you can also see some of the phosphorus in those. But that's what that is. Phosphorus is really important for root development, stem development on the grass. It also is something that we need to be very careful of, especially here in the Northwest, because we have so much rain. Phosphorus can flow through the soil a lot like nitrogen, but it's very mobile in the soil. And so we want to make sure it doesn't get into the waterways or down into the groundwater, because it can form some things in there that can actually be bad for fish, and phosphorylation and things like that. So we need to avoid that, but you do need a good healthy level in order to have good healthy grass. So potassium, another one. Those of you who used to eating Special K cereal, potassium is good for everybody. It's also good for grass. And potassium actually helps out with the structure of the grass. If you've got a lot of grass that's kind of limp, laying over, maybe a little bit yellow, it's a potassium deficiency. So we want that good potassium level in order to keep that grass good and strong. And here's some symptoms of the deficiency. Again, yellowing leaves, leaf tip dieback. So if you start seeing some of that around on your grass especially, you'll know you're a little low on potassium. But we need that potassium in order to have good, strong, standing grass for the horses to eat. If you get a potassium deficiency and your grass begins to lay down and limp a little bit, anytime, what we're trying to do is avoid any time when that horse can get down to the soil level. Because if they get down really low and they start touching that soil with their lips, those parasites can go straight in. So if you keep that grass a good healthy level and don't go below 3 inches when you graze, you're going to keep them away from those potential parasites. A lot of parasites can't go above 3 inches on the grass blade, or 3 or 4, depending on how thick the grass is, because UV light is one thing that they cannot stand, especially roundworms and things like that. If they get hit by UV light, and they'll dry out really fast. So even around here, they'll dry out. pH. Now, this is the one thing that we do battle a ton here. I didn't mean to make a pun there, because I'm going to tell you what we have to do here most of the time is when I go out and test the soil and the pH comes back at about 5.6, 5.7, which is very typical for soil in Western Washington. You have to add about 1 ton to 2 tons of lime per acre to bring that back up. And what we're aiming at is a pH of 6.5 to 7. That's where grass loves it. Now, every plant, every crop has its own pH range. So for this, this seminar, we're talking about pasture grass. And so pasture grass likes 6.5 to 7. Now, if you're growing blueberries, the blueberry will require a pH of about 4.6. Now that's really acidic, but that's what it needs. So you need to, when you're planning on spreading the lime, maybe give me a call or look around at what it might affect, because if you spread lime on a pasture and get that pH up to 6.5 to 7 and wonder why the blueberries on the edge of the pasture are dying, that'll be it. But pH here, we struggle with it for a couple of reasons. One, we have a lot of rain, and in that rain, what'll happen is it'll fall through the atmosphere and picks up nitrogen, and nitrogen will tend to lower the pH in the soil. So because you have the atmosphere is about 74% nitrogen, so when that water molecule falls through the air, the water molecule H2O is a polar molecule, which means it's a little magnetic on one end, and it'll pick up a nitrogen molecule, and it hits the ground and drives it into the soil. The other thing that we have is Seattle, and being a very big city, it produces a lot of pollutants, and that CO2 goes into the air, and then our rain falls through that CO2 in the air, and it grabs that CO2. And the water grabs the CO2, and then it could become carbolic acid, and then it hits the soil, and it makes the soil very acidic. So that's what we're battling. I've seen the soil drop over a couple of year period, almost a half a point, almost close to a half a point, yeah. In some areas, I've heard it go even faster downward. So when you put lime down, it's not going to be something you apply just once and you'll always have a 6.5 pH. You'll have 6.5 pH one year, and then over the next couple of years, it'll drop down to 6, and then it'll go to 5.5 real fast. So just plan on battling it all the time. But that pH, if we don't have that pH in that 6.5 to 7 range, then what will happen is the grass will struggle, because below 6.5, your potassium and your phosphorus, they begin to bind up. Phosphorus specifically loves aluminum in the soil. There's a lot of aluminum in the soil, and potassium likes iron. So they'll bind to those and not be available to the plant. And then the grass will begin to struggle, won't grow as well. And then pretty soon the horses are eating it, because the horses, I believe, can, when they have a grass that's struggling with nutrients, it doesn't taste as well to them as a good healthy grass. But if it's all they've got, and they will eat more of it, because it's like they need a certain caloric intake. And so if a grass is struggling with nutrients, it's not going to have the same caloric intake. Let's say a blade of grass or a clump of grass is like 25 calories. Well, if it's struggling, it might only be 12 instead of 25. So the horse is going to eat it down faster, and it's going to eat it to the ground. And that's where the parasites are that we're trying to fight. So we want to make sure that pH is in a good range, so that those nutrients are available to the plant, and that the plant then can become healthy, and the horse is satisfied with eating down only so far. So, and you can see in this picture the big leaf hydrangea. The basic soils are pink and the acidic soils are blue. So they're a little fun indicator. If you ever wondered which one it was, I always get them mixed up even. It's like, oh, which one's acidic? Well, it's the blue one. So lime, how do we adjust that pH? We adjust it by applying lime onto the pasture. Fall is the best time, although you can do it anytime you want. The only time I don't recommend you spreading it unless you want to invest in a lot of sprinklers is in the middle of summer, because lime is very dense and it requires a lot of water to break it down and to get it incorporated into the soil. So if you are stuck with applying it right now, maybe, or maybe in a month, I would plan on watering it a lot to get it to break down. Otherwise, and I'm kind of lazy in this, I just wait till October, put the lime down, let the winter rains break it down and put it in the soil, and then go on about your business. There are 3 different types of lime you could apply. There's chemical lime, which I have never seen around here. Now I've been here for a little bit now, but back on the plains we have, you know, chemical lime that we can apply, but it's pretty rare that we need it because we have pretty basic soils back there. But you'll never see it out here, so I wouldn't worry about that one. Agricultural lime, that is just plain limestone, broken up limestone. So that you can get that in any co-op, any coastal tractor supply. That's what they've got. And dolomite, you might hear the word dolomite. Dolomite is basically agricultural lime with added magnesium. And so if your soil test comes back where it's low in magnesium, that's when I would recommend dolomite lime. And I will tell you, I can tell you how much you'd want to put down with that. But basically, that's what that is. And then broadcast is how you do it. Apply the lime. It's either pelleted or powdered. I don't like the powdered at all, only because wind. Of course, I come from a windy area, so I'm kind of averse to doing anything where it's a powder. But even around here, if you apply the powder onto the pasture, even a slight wind is going to blow some of that off, and it's like, why lose it, you know? So I always go with pelleted. And the other thing about pelleted is if you apply the powdered onto the pasture and it doesn't get a good rain or get wet enough to get it off the leaves and to the ground level, you're going to have to wait to turn those horses back out on that pasture. Whereas if you had pelleted and you put it out there and it's got some time to get into the soil, even if some is laying on the ground, there, as long as they're not eating down to the ground level, they're going to be fine. So I much prefer the pelleted. It's a lot easier to handle. And if you're doing a cone spreader on the back of your tractor or the back of your lawnmower or whatever, it's a lot easier to dial in the pellets than it is the powdered, because a lot of those are seed spreaders and the pellets tend to be about the same size as some of the grass seeds they spread. So oh, and speaking of grass, just to throw this out there, because I know a lot of you always have a question about this, I would not recommend combining lime and grass seed. The reason is that a grass seed germinates or creates roots and opens up based on a hormone inside the seed that tells it when to open up and provide roots and everything else. So, and that hormone is sensitive to temperature, moisture, and pH, okay? So when you spread the lime out there, if you're spreading grass seed at the same time, all that grass seed is going to sense is that lime. And that lime is probably going to have a pH of about 10. So the grass seed needs to be at about 6.5, 7 in order to germinate. So it's just going to sit there and do nothing. And then the birds will come along and eat it. Taste a little chalky, but they'll eat it. So don't recommend that. So if you can put down lime, wait about a couple of weeks before you put down grass seed. So, and fertilizing, I recommend you break up fertilizing to about 3 times a year. About spring, early summer, and early fall. Early summer, like right about now-ish, you might have to water some, but yeah, I recommend breaking it up a little bit. And there are different fertilizer, you can apply different fertilizer different times. So the way I like to look at it is early fall, you're putting the grass to bed. Spring, you're waking it up. And the early summer, you're getting it ready for that really tough period where we don't get as much rain and the grass struggles and goes dormant. So just to review, the physical health, we want to create heavy use areas, keep those horses off, and protect those pastures. Manure bins, gutters and downspouts, and then proper pasture management, where you're making sure they don't graze below 3 inches, you're pulling them off at the right time, and you're making sure that pasture's healthy. And that health requires chemical and biological health as well, the MPK and the soil pH. Now here's the picture of my place in Kansas back in 2008. These are the horses I brought in from Wichita and Kansas, or Texas. Dirt, no grass, mud everywhere. Of course, it didn't have much rain out there, but we did have mud. And so that was in 08. And here's 2010. No mud, pot of gold, healthy horses, healthy grass. You can see here on the bottom left-hand side, it says KFRM 550 AM. That's the agricultural radio station in Kansas, and they liked that picture and made it their picture of the month. So it was kind of fun. But that's 2 years, and I've got grass. Now I worked a lot with my local NRCS guy, figuring out the soil and everything else. I learned a lot doing that right there, but it is possible. So if you're looking at back out your window at your pasture and it looks like, what I started with, you can, with good management and good tools and just working at it, you can get it like that. So, and that's about the pasture. And again, I'm a farm planner with the Snohomish Conservation District. So please contact me anytime. Sarah?
Yay, thank you, Michael. That's wonderful, as always. And I always love that picture at the end with the rainbow and you with the dog and the horses. And now we have the incredible pleasure to introduce Dr. Dana. Dr. Dana, would you like to take it away?
Well, sure. I don't know. It's going to be kind of hard to follow, Michael. Glad there's no video because it's kind of a tough day. So you guys are spared the mud and blood on my outfit. So there's a lot of myths to dispel about parasite control in horses. And I'm going to take a few minutes during my slideshow to kind of talk about the things, the old wives' tales that I hear about during the day, which kind of make me giggle because they're not very true. But we'll start with just the overview. The parasites that Michael's talking about, there's a lot of them. And we need to address these parasites for the health of the horse, obviously. And compared to when I started my career to now, we've done a fabulous job. I used to see a lot more evidence parasites in horses than I do now, and I think the owners are taking this problem really seriously. But and the things that Michael touched on that the parasites do to the horse, you end up feeding the parasite and the horse, which robs your bank account. They can also cause damage to their internal organs and make it difficult for the horse to absorb the nutrients that it needs. Are you advancing my slides for me, Sarah?
Sorry, Michael is, and we are going to be on top of that now.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah, next slide, please.
Okay.
Great. So, so those are the things we worry about, damage to the horse, damage to the pocketbook. Those are the two main things. Next slide, please. So establishing the deworming program is really important. It used to be that we were told to deworm our horses every time the farrier came out, which is every 6 to 8 weeks, and that's really overkill. Next slide, please. You want to feed the horse, you don't want to feed the parasite, and there's a lot of parasites that we're worried about. And these are just kind of a brief list of the ones that everybody is probably already familiar with: the small strangels, ascarids, tapeworms, pinworms. Next slide, please. Uh-oh. Sorry about that, my phone just rang. The picture that you see there, those are bots that are living in the stomach of the horse, and that's one of the life cycles. All of these parasites have different life cycles. They have different times when they shoot the larva out into the environment, different times that they're hatching inside the horse, and they're all very, very different. Go ahead, next slide. And some of the life stages of the parasites are more damaging than others. For example, the bot picture that we just saw, those are the larva stage. The adults are actually flies that live in the environment, and then the flies lay the eggs on the horse's legs. You've probably all seen the pictures or seen them on your horse, those little yellow eggs that attach to the hair. And the life cycles of these parasites are fascinating, and I don't have the time to go through each individual one, but I can point everybody at a wonderful video series by Dr. Martin Nielsen at the University of Kentucky. He has a 7-video series called The Parasite Journey of the Horse, and he goes through all the life cycles of each of these parasites and how smart they are to want to survive. So they will only be in the environment, or they try to be in the environment when they're going to survive versus coming out to die. So when I talk to my clients about collecting their fecal samples, which we need to do every year, I'm very specific about not collecting fecal samples in the middle of winter when it's icy and snowy and cold, because the parasites are smart enough that they're not going to be shedding their eggs or their larvae into the manure when they're going to come out and freeze. So next slide, please. So Dr. Martin really discusses the life cycles in a very entertaining way, and it makes it really stick in your mind. When would be the best time to collect your fecal samples, and how these parasites have survived and how they're thriving. And we are getting more and more parasites that are resistant to the dewormers that we have. And that's going to be our big issue in the future, is making sure that we don't contribute to parasite resistant problems by over deworming our horses. So this life cycle of strangel parasite slide is a very general life cycle, and it's kind of what happens with most of the species. But like I said, if you want to see more about their life cycle, you can go to Dr. Martin's presentation. Next slide, please. So small strangels are very interesting. Small strangels are, there's a lot of different species of small strangels, and the biggest take-home message about small strangels is they can encyst in the horse's intestines and live there for years before they hatch out. So if you take a fecal sample and your horse comes back with a low count, you can't be confident that that's going to be because it doesn't have parasites at that moment. You can be confident that they're not shedding them at that moment, but they may still be in there, and they can live in your horse for several years before they hatch out. So taking fecal samples biannually or at least annually is super important. The other thing to note is that the encysted larvae are pretty much protected from the parasite treatments that we use. So your dewormers don't affect the parasites when they're lodged in the intestine. Next slide, please. Oh, and I already said all that. So next slide, please. I've had the opportunity to open up horses in some different countries where they don't have access to dewormers here, and the damage that's caused to the intestines is remarkable. And it's also remarkable to see horses that haven't ever had a deworming program get on a deworming program and watch their body condition scores go up and their hair coats get better, and basically they're able to use the nutrition that they're being fed, even if it's limited nutrition, a whole lot better. And I know we're talking about pasture in relationship to parasites, and it's springtime, so I can't not mention lice. So it's really common right now to
I think we lost you, Dr. Dana. Oh, she's joining back up. Thank you all for your patience. And I do see a question in the Q&A, and just let everyone know that I will be asking those at the end.
I'm back.
There she is. Thank you, Dr. Dana.
I will. Yay, sorry about that. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is just another reminder that drug resistance to small strangels specifically is one of the major problems we're facing. So don't over deworm your horse. Next slide, please. The other thing I've heard that's very interesting is that you should deworm with the phases of the moon. And I can tell you that I have searched and searched for scientific evidence that that is a thing, and it's really not a thing. The other interesting thing is that you deworm foals differently than you deworm adult horses. So I have seen a lot more adult horses that have resistance to fenbendazole or Panacure, and I don't even use that in the rotation for my horses anymore. Moxidectin and ivermectin with praziquantel are the dewormers that I use on my adults, but I do use the Panacure for the foals. Next slide, please. And another gross picture of parasites, and I think you've probably all seen those. These are bloodworms, which are large strangels. Next slide, please. And large strangels, when I graduated, was the big topic because we could see them in the manure. You can't see the small strangels in the manure. So ascarids you can see, bots you can see, but small strangels you can't. And there's more species of small strangels than there are large strangels. And large strangels are sensitive to everything, and they don't have that encysted larva stage. Next slide, please. And the ascarids or roundworms, those are the ones that you see with the foals. And I've been particularly disgusted with ascarids as they come flying out of the horse's nose, the foal's nose, or they come out in big globs when you're tubing a horse. It's fun. So, but those are sensitive to Panacure, fenbendazole, and easily controlled as well. Next slide, please. There's a lovely picture of some worms coming out of an intestine on the necropsy of a foal. Next slide, please. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on gross pictures and things like that. But it is important to get the babies dewormed. There's also a myth that you should deworm your mare, your pregnant mare, right before she foals. And there was a doctor who did a lot of research on, he was actually the first one to discover that larvae can pass from the mare to the foal through the milk. And that is true. However, deworming the mare before foal resulted in no better control of the parasites in the foals than if you don't deworm. So, and I was taught that, to deworm the mares before they fold, and it really doesn't make any difference at all. So if you've forgotten to do that before your foals, you did no harm. Next slide, please. And one of the things, another kind of a myth people talk about is the ascarids causing these, if you deworm your horse and they've got a big load of ascarids and they all die at once, that you can get a big wad of worms that causes a colic. And that's true in the full-size horses by any means. It can happen in the foals. However, when people say give half a dose of dewormer and then follow it up with another half a dose of dewormer, that's really effective to kill the parasites to begin with. So you're basically not doing much for the infestation at all. The best thing to do is keep your foals on a proper deworming program from birth, and then you won't end up with a big parasite load to deal with the deworming. The next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about tapeworms, because tapeworms are hard to kill. The only anti-parasitic that we have on the market right now that gets them is the praziquantel. And you can run fecals all day long and you're not going to see a tapeworm. They do not show up in a fecal exam. So when you do your fecal and you get a negative, so you don't need to deworm at this feces and the larvae and the feces, and that doesn't necessarily. The only way to know if your horse has tapeworms is a blood test that's not on the market yet. So if you've been getting fecal samples on your horses and deworming based on the fecal samples and then not deworming because they're low, you're missing the tapeworms. Every horse needs to be dewormed for tapeworms, I think, at least once a year. The incidence of tapeworm in this area is about 33%. So 33% of horses have tapeworms. Again, there's no way of knowing if yours is one of the 33%. So probably best to give them a dewormer. In Michigan, the incidence of tapeworms is around 99%. So almost all the horses in Michigan have the parasite. And these things change, the demographics change over the years. So just like diseases, things migrate from one area to another. There was a time when we didn't really have much in the way of heartworm in dogs, and then Hurricane Katrina happened and all of us brought dogs home to save their lives, and then we brought heartworm to the area. So as we become a more global industry with horses being transported for shows and breeding and whatnot, the parasites are going to be more ubiquitous and they're going to be everywhere. Next slide, please. Oh, that's another gross picture of tapeworms. We can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, if you've ever seen a tapeworm, holy moly, they're disgusting. And then lungworms. Lungworms you generally don't cause horses. That it's pretty rare, but donkeys often get it. So if you have a coughing donkey or a donkey that is coughing and not thrifty, which I haven't seen a non-thrifty donkey in a lot of years in this country, lots in other countries, but you need to consider lungworms and deworm them for lungworms. Next slide, please. And this parasite, the pinworms, are probably one of my favorite. Their life cycle is interesting, and the slide is showing the female that is spewing out packets of eggs. So in that slime that's coming out of the horse's rectum, there are thousands or millions of eggs, and the horse gets itchy when these come out, and they'll itch along the fence post, and then those eggs are pinned to the fence post, and then if somebody else comes by, another horse comes by, takes a lick or a rub, then those eggs are on that other horse, and that's how they infest from one horse to another. And you can take a piece of Scotch tape, and if your horse is itching its tail, take the Scotch tape around the rectal area, and then if you have access to a microscope, put the Scotch tape on the microscope slide, look down. Yeah. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Dr.
Okay, sorry, my phone rang again. And you'll see the eggs, which is super interesting, but you have to have access to a microscope. Next slide, please. Okay, so we already covered the bots, and the other myth is the threadworms. So threadworms are different from neck threadworms. So I've been hearing a lot of people talk about their horses itching their mane, so they must have neck threadworms. Well, neck threadworms are onchocerca, and threadworms are actually small strangels. So small strangels you can't see them unless you look really, really closely with a kind of a microscope, but they're tapered at one end and they look like a needle. And that's why they're called threadworms. The onchocerca, which we don't have much of here, can migrate through the skin, but they're all completely different worm. So don't confuse the two. Next slide, please. We kind of already covered that slide. Next slide, please. So fecal egg counts. Fecal egg counts are the way to know if your horse is a low shedder, a moderate shedder, or a high shedder. All three of those categories require different deworming schedules. And you can't take a fecal sample from one horse on a 10-horse farm and determine that all 10 horses are that result. So say you've got 10 horses, one of your horses, you take a fecal sample, it comes back low shedder, then you cannot assume that everybody is a low shedder. Every individual has a different immune system and a different ability to react to these parasites. So every horse on the farm needs to have their own fecal egg count. And the fecal egg counts need to be done at a reputable lab. There's some, you can't do a horse fecal egg count with a dog fecalizer test. So a lot of people that work at small animals horse do a fecal float, and that is not accurate. The eggs are different than in the canine and the feline species, so you won't get the results that you're looking for. Most people will get a negative there and think their horse doesn't have an egg load, and when they actually do. So the fecal egg count needs to be done at a reputable lab that has a centrifuge and has all of the methods to count them. They have to put it on a slide with a grid and then use a particular counter. And thank goodness I don't have that job. I wouldn't have the patience, but it's a whole lot more accurate than just looking at a sample under a microscope. Next slide, please. And again, here it says that, horses with 0 or low egg counts likely still have worms. So don't assume with a negative fecal egg count that your horse has no parasites, because that's false. Next slide. so this is true too, that there's no deworming product that is 100% effective. The best one on the market, if you have a horse and you have $20 in your pocket to spend on a dewormer, the Quest with Praziquantel or Quest Plus is what it's called, would be the one that I would suggest that you buy. They haven't found resistance yet. And if we're using it every 6 to 8 weeks like we used to, there probably won't be. And it's just like using antibiotics. Use your deworming products judiciously so that we don't create a resistance. Next slide, please. Every horse is different, and every horse needs a different program. And that's where you have to take everything into consideration. Their exposure to the eggs and their exposure to the pasture. And what I tell my clients that run breeding facilities or having people come to their facility, there's all these different recommendations, like, oh, they need to have all their shots, they need to have this and that. But I rarely hear people say, you can't come to my farm unless your horse is a low shedder. And I think that's really important, because I don't want another horse on my property that has a high fecal egg count and shedding a huge amount of worms. It doesn't take very many fecal bowel movements to contaminate your pasture. So if you run a boarding facility, I would suggest that anybody that comes in gets a negative fecal. Next slide. So this slide I have a little bit of a problem with, and I would like to take number 2 completely out. We're talking about resistance to dewormers, and if you want to create one, feed strangels C. It was great in the 90s when it first came out. It helped a lot of horses, and then we started to see the parasites becoming resistant to it, and now I don't think it is efficacious at all. And I don't know very many veterinarians that recommend it anymore. It's pretty old school. And then number 3, we could take that out of there too, because the paste wormers that you can get at the feed store are highly effective. And I don't know any veterinarians that really put a nasogastric tube down them just to get a dewormer in them. Next slide. So, and now is where we marry up with Michael's talk. Keeping your pastures managed is huge. Composting your manure is also huge. I see lots of pastures that are overgrazed and no management of the manure, and it breaks my heart, because I wouldn't want to stand in my poo, and I don't think the horses want to stand in their poo either. And then it's not just parasites, it's the quality of their hoofs, and it's the quality of where they're standing affects their skin. And if you're gonna feed your horse, don't throw the hay into a pile of manure. I wouldn't want to eat if somebody threw my food on top of my poo. It's common sense. And if you're tuned into this webinar, I'm sure that you don't do any of that. So I think it's our duty to try to say something to people that do. Next slide, please. And this again goes back to what Michael said about composting. Composting is the only way to kill the worms. If you can broadcast your manure across your pasture, but in this geographical area, basically all you're doing is spreading the worm load out. So keep it in a pile, keep it away from where you feed, and call Michael out to help you with a farm plan. Next slide. There's those bots. Those are bot eggs, and they live on the horse's skin and hair. They attach pretty firmly, and then the horse licks them off, and then they go into the stomach. And then that was the slide that you saw earlier with those giant bots in their stomach. So when they have the bots in the stomach, that decreases the surface area where they can digest their food. Next slide. And this is kind of redundant. So next slide, please. So this list of people, I am not on it. I'm not a parasitologist. However, Martin Nielsen is the guy. He's at the University of Kentucky, and his webinars are very entertaining, and I encourage everybody to look those up and enjoy them. And that's pretty much all I had to say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dana, and thank you, Michael. I did find Dr. Nielsen's link, and I included that in the chat to folks and on our Facebook, so folks do have access to those videos, and I'm sure are interested. If you all don't mind, we do have a few questions if everyone would like to keep listening, and I'm sure they do. So the first question is, at this time, I only have one horse and I'm looking to purchase another horse. Can parasites travel from one horse to another?
Absolutely, yes. Sorry, I just had another call. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, absolutely, yes. And it's fecal oral transmission is usually the way that they go. However, those bots, that's not really fecal oral because they're attached to the hair. And lice, which is also a parasite, they jump on the horse to get a blood meal, and they'll jump from horse to horse. So absolutely.
Thank you. And then a different question from the same person. If they were to take their horse off the property and ride on public riding trails, is there anything specific that they should be looking for in terms of, you know, parasites or anything else that could be harmful to their horse?
Yeah, so around here we also have ticks, which is also a parasite. So if I were riding my horse in the woods, which is pretty much what we have here, I would spray my horse with a good fly repellent spray, and then check carefully for ticks when you get home. And then I probably wouldn't let my horse eat along the trail, especially if there was manure along the side, because that's just another route to get them infected.
Perfect.
I have another little tip I've done in the past. Another way to avoid picking those things up is make sure your horse's tail is not long and dragging the ground. Trim it up, you know, and make sure that it's not touching the ground. I see a lot of horses out on the trail, they're dragging the ground where you're just picking up stuff from there. So
That's good to know. Thank you both. Calling for last questions. I'm going to look on Facebook real quick to see if we have any further questions. Just have some comments on Facebook. Great info. Thank you so much, Dr. Dana and Michael. And yeah, folks have been really excited to hear about this. It's being recorded, so I know folks will certainly watch it on our YouTube channel. And, you know, if you're all looking for a good veterinarian, Dr. Dana Westerman is always busy, but she loves what she does, and that's what makes her so good. And same with Michael, equally as busy, available for site visits, but there may be a little bit of a waiting list because this is the busy season coming up. So we're going to last call for questions. I appreciate both of you for taking the time to speak with us today, sharing your expertise, and just being available. So thank you. And thank you, Dr. Dana, for persevering with your technical issues. I'm so happy that you did get to join us today.
Oh, thank you so much.
All right, I think that's it for questions. We're going to call it quits, y'all. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Dana, pleasure. Thank you, Michael. Everyone says thank you so much. All right, bye.